Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawn 2 following the third batch of episodes, also known as episode 9. And this was a pretty fun week. This was obviously the swap week. And I feel like this led itself to some pretty fun gameplay and obviously some pretty fun downfalls, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 18 people to talk about, and with some more time, let's get into the video. So starting off at number 18, we have the first boot from this week, and here we have Rich. And this wasn't too surprising. I was pretty low on Rich for a lot of the season, and I feel like there was a lot of setup to him, not really being well positioned, to where even after he went over to the Brawn tribe, we got that scene of them not really wanting him around. And obviously, considering that none of the Brains really wanted him around either, it's not too surprising that he became this consensus target by the end of it, which is even interesting considering that he was technically supposed to be the swing vote, where he should have been in a spot to where he should have had connections to both of the sides, and through that could have been the swing vote, but instead seemingly no one really cared for him in the game, and that he was his pretty easy boot. And again, his edit in the latest episode was pretty subdued either, where he talked about this being his second act on the Bronze, that he was going to be more reserved, but that's too boring for him. So again, I don't feel like the Rich one was really there. I don't think Rich is really set up to do well here. And obviously, Rich is someone who played pretty sloppily for the most part. It didn't really seem like he connected with a lot of the cast, to where even Laura, the one true bond that he had, was there more so to use him as a shield. And obviously, at the point where he was separated from Laura, it didn't really make much sense to keep him around here, even though there was still a possibility that he could have been on the board to target Logan, and obviously that was something that AJ had talked about doing before, but then even AJ backs away from it and wants to target him, so obviously that's not particularly great. And again, Rich is someone who's probably not going to be very high in the player ranking, all things considered. Then again, I'm probably going to feel that same way about the other boots from this week, but we'll get this soon enough. But Rich is now out of the game. Tori's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have the next booth from this week, and here we have Ursula. And Ursula's another one that probably should have been in an interesting spot coming into the swap, where she was very blatantly at the bottom of the Brawn contingent, and through that she should have been easily picked up as a number by the Brains to assert even more control over them. Though at the same time, the Brawn still had this opportunity to where they could have used Paulie successfully to blindside one of the Brains there. So I feel like Ursula's someone who probably should have been pretty safe coming into the swap, but like Rich, she's someone that didn't really have any connections and also plays pretty actively bad, to where she blatantly distanced herself from Nunan, just wants nothing to do with her, to the point where she even goes against the plan, even when it wasn't in her best interest. And for her to just be the consensus target at the next tribal after Rich goes sort of speaks to how, again, no one really cared for her in the game. And like Rich, I feel like Ursula also played a pretty bad game. Now, there's definitely an argument for Ursula having played more actively bad, as she more actively pushed away the likes of Nunan and just refused to listen to any sort of argument from the Nunan and Paulie side, which is blindly against her at the point where she felt like Nunan was being a bit of a snake. So obviously that's not particularly great. And again, with her having been on the bottom originally with her attachment to Nash, again, I'm not saying Ursula played a good game at all. And she was also someone who I didn't really see as a contender either in terms of their edit. And I feel like their edit pretty clearly set up their downfall by the end of it. So obviously that's a shame, but she's obviously also out of the game as well, to where she's here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have the final boot from this week, and here we have Max. And just like Rich and Ursula, another person that has a pretty dramatic downfall here across this week. Mind you, I feel like Max's downfall is a bit more set up, where we obviously saw last week that he played pretty sloppily in that round, which made it pretty clear that he wasn't going to do all moving forward. And then obviously moving into this week, we see him once again continuing this rivalry with Miles by calling him the jungle rat, which I know a lot of people online were pretty upset by it, but supposedly they agreed upon it and are on good terms because of that. And again, I feel like Max is someone who didn't really get that much to do until the episode where they go to Tribal, but I feel like that episode pretty clearly set up his downfall, where he talks about how the swap worked out great for him and how his plan once again is to target Miles, but at the same time, kind of misplays his hand here, where similar to Ursula, he just simply refused to work with Miles, to the point where he even tells Laura point blank that he doesn't want to work with Miles, even when it was in their best interest to do so. But at the same time, despite him being very clearly open to wanting to work with the Bronze, they are also not willing to work with him and kind of think he's a loose cannon, to where he is, once again, a pretty consensus target by the end of it. And then on top of that, you have him going out with an idol in his pocket, which is obviously pretty funny there. So again, Max was a pretty fun character, someone who I never thought was going to win the season at the point when the season started, even though he was pretty high in my preseason power ranking. I just felt like the edit wasn't there for Max when he ended up being a bit more zany than I expected. He ended up being more of a character than I expected, which is obviously good for the show, but obviously was not good for him gameplay wise. And obviously, he is now out of the game as well, to where he's here at number 16. And with that, we have 15 people left again to talk about. As usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But number 15, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on, is not the same person I had the previous 2 weeks. We actually have a new person at the very bottom, and that person is Kate. And I feel like Kate has kind of fallen off the face of the earth edit wise, to where she pretty much gets nothing this week outside of her kind of being part of the plan to split the votes on Max and Miles, which is obviously not great. The fact that we don't really get much from her perspective there. You also have the fact that she was technically a target this week, to where we see Miles wanting to target her for being pretty outgoing, even though we don't really see much of that on the show. So again, I feel like Kate is someone who has kind of died off edit wise. We don't really know much about her. And we didn't really know much about her to begin with. So because of that, I feel like considering the content that other people got from this week, I did have to bump her all the way to the bottom here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have another person who is pretty under-edited this week, and just in general. But number 14, we do have PD. And again, PD has kind of fallen off the face of the earth, where he is once again pretty invisible this week. And considering that he was also not very visible last week and was really only getting any content in the premiere, I feel like PD is someone else who, at this point, I feel is pretty much has no shot of winning. And while he seems like a competent player and someone who probably could make it to the merge at this point, considering his current position, I feel like the fact that the story has just completely neglected him and we just don't know very much about him at all, I feel like he's another one that I had to have towards the bottom here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have another person that pretty much got nothing this week. But number 13, we do have Jesse. And again, Jesse's someone who technically got a bit more in the previous weeks compared to the people we just talked about. And to be honest, even compared to someone we're about to be talking about. But again, I feel like he's just kind of fallen off the face of the earth, where his only content comes like during the scramble in episode 9, where the Brawns are talking about what to do there, talking about pulling in Max. But beyond that, pretty much nothing here. And considering the one visibility spike he got before this was somewhat negative, I feel like Jesse's another person who I'm pretty much out on at this point, which is why he's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and what do you know? We have another Brawn member, and another Brawn member who's got pretty much nothing this week, and that person is Morgan. And in general, I feel like the Brawn tribe is very unlikely to actually win the season. I feel like they're way more underdeveloped compared to the Brains tribe, which is a bit of a spoiler for later on in the list. And I feel like Morgan's yet another person that fits into this category, got pretty much nothing this week. And again, while she could make it to the merge, and while she seems like a competent player, I just feel like at this point, I'm pretty much out on her. Where the one reason she's above the people we already talked about is she did at least have a fine premiere, and she didn't have as blatant negativity compared to Jessie, which was enough to have her above like the other people that pretty much got nothing this week, but really not feeling great about her to actually win the game at this point, which is why she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we're now moving on to people that actually got content this week. And we actually had the person who was at the very bottom of the ranking for the first 2 weeks, but now they finally got some screen time. And at number 11, we do have Ben. And the fact that it took until episode 8 for Ben to get a confessional is really mind-blowing, as he seems like someone who's in the majority right now. He seems like someone who isn't that bad of a player, outside the fact that they're very boring. But again, he is the last person on the season to get a confessional, where he obviously gets some visibility in episode 8, gets more visibility in episode 9, which is obviously something to point out here. Now, is the content that he gets good? You could definitely debate that. But I mean, the fact that he's at least getting stuff on the show was enough to have him above the people that have not gotten any content this week. But at the end of the day, I just feel like it's too little too late. And even with the content that it got, I feel like it largely felt circumstantial, and it didn't really learn much about who he is as a person or where he truly stands in the game. Where again, he does seem to be part of the majority, but we don't really get much focus on that aspect. So for that reason, not feeling great about him. So he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who got a bit more screen time this week as well, but still not someone I'm feeling that great about, and that person is Kristen. And I did debate Kristen a little bit, as she did get a bit more visibility this week than the people we already talked about. And we did technically learn a bit more about her, to where we did learn that she's a firefighter. That's something at least, even though it wasn't an intro package. And I think she's a bit more relevant to the story at this point, to where we see her relationship with AJ playing at this point. And I do feel like something to give her is that I do think Kristen will probably be a key role in taking out AJ whenever that comes. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of her content beyond that is very inconsistent. And I feel like the people above Kristen are people who I probably have a bit more faith in to win from an edgic perspective. Whereas I feel like Kristen, even with the content she's getting right now, a lot of it just feels circumstantial, where a lot of it just feels like she's there as a foil to AJ. So I feel like for that reason, I'm not feeling that good about Kristen either. But again, she at least got screen time this week to where she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and that person is AJ. And AJ obviously was the star this week from a screen time perspective. We got so much from his perspective this week. He's obviously probably the main character of the season right now, which is obviously something to point out. But it's also a case where I don't think he's winning, where I feel like we're already seeing plenty of people talking negatively about him and his entire strategy. That makes me think that a downfall is coming sooner rather than later. Where obviously this week we see him taking control of the new swap tribe that he's on, and obviously eventually implementing this whole hostage strategy where he's basically just blackmailing the other tribe into throwing the challenge so that they'll keep the others on his tribe safe. And obviously we do see the other tribe do so, only to vote out Max, who was probably not the person AJ was looking for them to take out, but whatever. And it seems like this whole thing is going to continue on Sunday night as well, where we get the shot of AJ and Ben both trying to throw the challenge and just not doing the challenge at all, which is pretty funny. But regardless, we also see a lot of people talking pretty negatively about this whole thing, how AJ's being domineering, how his strategy is dumb. And again, I just don't think AJ is going to do well moving forward. I would be very surprised if he gets towards the end game at this point, as I feel like with the way that he's playing and with the way that he's being presented on the show, I just feel like he's probably going to be sniped out either at the end of the pre-merge or probably early on the merge. So not feeling great about AJ. While he is a big character, while he's getting a lot of screen time, I just don't think he's being propped up as someone we're supposed to be rooting for, which is why he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who's been getting quite a bit of screen time across this past week, but another person who I don't think is winning. But number 8, we do have Zara. And Zara is someone who is sort of getting a bit of screen time here. She's been a narrator on her tribe, mostly talking negatively about Miles, to where we get that scene in episode 8 where she's complaining about Miles and how he's talking about strategy and that he's trying too hard to get with the old Brawn when it's not really working. That's not particularly great. And then obviously in episode 9, you have her decision to flip against Miles out of self-preservation, which to be fair is probably the correct move. Only it doesn't really work out after Miles ends up playing the idol for himself, and now she's kind of in an awkward spot. So again, I feel like Zara, from a gameplay perspective, was probably not in the greatest spot on her new tribe here. Obviously, their tribe is still down in numbers. Though at the same time, I do think she probably has some longevity within her to where I could see her being a major character later on the season. However, at the same time, I don't think it's a winning trajectory, to where I said this in my preseason power ranking, that I think Zara has a lot of potential to be like this losing finalist. And I think with the content that she's been getting, where she was completely invisible in week 1, and while she's been getting more focus later on, I feel like the fact that she got nothing in the premiere, and also the fact that a lot of her content now is just her kind of dodoing on Miles, who I do think we're supposed to be rooting for, it makes me think that Zara is not really on a winning trajectory, to where again, I think losing finalists will make a lot of sense for Zara at this point, even though it's still pretty early on in the season. But in general, I feel like Zara, the reason she's as high is that she's at least been getting content on the show. That's something at least. She's not completely invisible, and she does seem to be like a recurring character on the season. But I just don't think it's going to lead to a win at this point, which is why she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and kind of similar to Zara, this is someone who is technically one of the bigger characters on the season, even though this was a pretty quiet week for them. However, I still don't think they're going to go on to win the season. But number 7, we do have Paulie, and Paulie's kind of in this weird spot as well, to where I feel like he is kind of this big character on the season, one of the bigger players on the Brawn side of things with his relationship with Nunan. Obviously, he was pretty much involved in episodes 7 and 8, where he was part of the plans to take out both Rich and Ursula, though at the same time he was discussed as a potential target, where we saw AJ wanting to snipe him out of the game, even though they didn't go through by the end of it. However, he's still getting a decent amount of screen time on the actual show, which definitely elevates him above these people who have been purpled or have been getting less consistent content. But sort of similar to Zara, while he is getting a decent amount of content, I just don't think it's going to lead to a win. I feel like we don't really have like that winning trajectory with Paulie. It just feels like he's there as his big character and someone who's probably going to be blindsided at some point along the way, possibly with the idol in his pocket, though we'll have to see how that plays out. And I feel like Nunan is someone who is clearly more of a narrator for the season compared to Paulie. So I feel like Paulie's probably going to be booted relatively soon, as I feel like there just isn't enough complexity with his edit to justify a win. I feel like a lot of his content feels pretty surface level, a lot of it feels pretty gameplay focused, and we're not really getting as much of his perspective as I would like, which is why he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person has dropped off compared to last week. I actually had this person at number 1 last week, but after reassessing their edit and after seeing how this week played out for them, I did decide to drop Laura here. And again, I still think Laura is someone who has some pros going for her. I feel like her week 1 was, for the most part, pretty strong. And while in hindsight, I assessed her week 2 a bit too highly, I still think she didn't really have as many negatives as it seemed like on the face of it. But I feel like this week was definitely a lot more negative, where the fact that we lose Rich, someone who she was actively trying to keep in the game, only for her to have no real response to that is pretty bad. Now you could say that it wasn't really a real relationship, that she was just using him as a shield, but the fact that we don't really get any response from Laura talking about how she needs to find a new shield now and how the Rich boot has to make her readjust is probably not a great sign there. It makes me think that it's not really as big of a focus as what it probably should have. And the fact that we got all that screen time of Laura fighting to keep Rich during all those tribals was there just because it needed to explain why Rich was in the boot in those spots. So it definitely feels more circumstantial now than what it seemed a bit before. And then obviously from a gameplay perspective, this was not a great week for her either, where she ends up in a pretty bad swap, down in numbers. We see her like explaining how she has to flip to keep herself safe, obviously fails to keep Miles around, only for that to be for naught by the end of it. And obviously it's not great that she wasn't able to get the bronze to her side, the fact that she wasn't able to keep Max in line to ensure that they could have made this idle play to take out one of the bronze there. So, and I feel like Laura's still probably in a tight situation, though I think she'll probably squeeze her way to the merge as well. However, at this point, I'm probably higher than other people, if I'm being honest. And I feel like the fact that we didn't get any response to Rich being taken out of the game is a pretty big knock for her there. And we haven't really gotten as much focus from her as I would like. Not as much narration from her side of things as I would like. Or while she does get one confessional in the swap episode, the fact that we don't get more of a focus on her until the actual episode she goes to tribal is not ideal either. So I feel like those things, plus my reassessment of her week 2, was a big reason why she has dropped all the way here to number 6. Now moving on to number 5, moving to someone who I still see as a dark horse, even though they haven't really popped off on the show as much. But number 5, we do have Kaylin. Now admittedly, I think this week was more of a mixed bag for Kaylin, where his main content comes in episode 8 and lead to the tribal there, where he's blatantly not getting his way, where he talks about how AJ is wrong for targeting Ursula and that they're much better off going for Paulie, but then he just proceeds to vote out Ursula there. So the fact that he got to talk about how targeting Ursula would be a bad decision, but then does so anyway, is not the greatest look, in my personal opinion. And obviously the fact that that's his main content from this week is probably a bad sign, but very similar to how I felt about him in the last 2 weeks, I still see him as this dark horse contender, where despite him not getting that much visibility compared to some of the bigger characters of the season, he'll still rise up and get his perspective on things, even when it's not really that necessary to the events of the episode. So I feel like Kaylin's still someone who I am looking at as a possible contender, even though I haven't really gotten that silver bullet that would really want me to elevate him too much higher here. But still, it's good enough for him to be here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and as a spoiler for the rest of the list, this is the highest ranked Brawn member left on the board, and here we have Nunan. And again, Nunan has been the narrator of the season more or less here. Now, admittedly, obviously, from a gameplay perspective, this was not the greatest week for her, where you have Ursula targeting her once again. And while she does get her way in taking out Ursula, and that could be construed as positive as her overcoming adversity, I don't think the show does that much to capitalize on that, where the episode after Ursula gets taken out, we don't really hear much from Nunan. She is actually invisible in episode 9. So the fact that Nunan doesn't really get to talk about having taken out Ursula when Ursula was clearly coming after her was probably not the greatest look there either. But still, she is by far the most developed member of the Brawn tribe here, and that's why she is the highest ranked of the Brawns. And if a Brawn were to go on to win the season, I guess it's Nunan. But truth be told, I do feel a bit better about the top 3 players at this point, which is why Nunan is left behind here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is someone who admittedly didn't get that much screen time across this week, and you can definitely argue them being lower. However, I think this episode also didn't really do that much to lower my opinion of them. But at number 3, we do have Logan. And again, Logan is someone who's technically not in the greatest spot on her tribe right now, to where she's obviously still looked at as a potential target moving forward. I don't think that's particularly great. Though at the same time, she does get a pretty big edit during the swap where she does get to talk about how the Brains have the 5-4 majority there. If they sit together, then they control the vote. And obviously, she gets a lot of these set up to Rich being the spanner in the works that eventually results in them having to cut Rich there and having to give up their majority. But even so, they're able to eventually get around in the episode 8 boot, taking out Ursula, even though she gets no content there. And then in episode 9, she does get to react to the tribal, where she gets to talk about how she's upset at AJ for being so domineering, how he's an idiot for telling the other tribe to throw the challenge there. So again, the fact that Logan is the main one vocalizing her disappointment with AJ makes me think that she could also be a key contributor to taking out AJ when it eventually comes to it. And with me feeling pretty confident that AJ is going to lose this eventual war here, I feel like Logan is definitely in a position to take out AJ in that spot alongside Kristen there. So I feel like Logan is still someone who, despite her not getting the most content in the world, is still someone who I am looking at as a contender, considering how the previous weeks have gone for her, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I kind of can't believe this person is this high, especially after this week. However, I'm actually kind of impressed by this person's edit despite all the circumstances they face within the game. But number 2, I did decide to go with Miles. Now, this was definitely a debate for me. I did consider having Miles a little bit lower, as he does get random negativity during the week, where in episode 8, he does get this negativity of him talking to the Bronze and Zara pointing out how he's just making the same mistake again of talking too much game too early, and this is what got him in trouble on the Brains tribe. So you can definitely argue that this was a bad look from Miles in that regard, but at the same time, I just don't think Zara is meant to be seen as the rooting interest here. I feel like Miles is more so the person that we as an audience are meant to be rooting for, where even though he is shown being in the wrong, and while he doesn't get to respond to that, which is a knock to his edit, I still think Miles is meant to be like this rootable figure, someone who's still getting screen time despite him like facing adversity there. It's not as if he's just having so much stuff happening to him and not responding to any of it. He's still responding to points where he's at the bottom, particularly with the whole Max situation there. And then obviously you get to the tribal where he is a primary target, to the point where Laura and Zara decide to flip to save face, only to have Miles playing the idol on himself, keeping himself safe there. So it's kind of strange in a sense, because Miles is someone who's technically in a pretty bad position gameplay wise. He obviously had to play the idol spot to keep himself safe. That's not particularly great. And then you still have people talking negatively about him. But at the same time, the fact that he's been getting as big of an edit as he has, and not necessarily in a way to where the show is not wanting us to root for him, makes me think that he could be this surprise contender down the road. Now, we'll have to see how next week plays out, obviously, but I feel like considering where things stand right now, I'm actually feeling kind of okay about Miles, even with all the adversity that he's faced here. Not to mention that with Max out of the game now, who was his big adversary for him, he could start to find his footing more and could find himself to working more with Laura and Zara. So again, it could still work out for him by the end of it. And I feel like it's for that reason that I have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawn 2 right now is Karin. And I think Karin is in a pretty interesting spot, to where I feel like she had been getting pretty solid content across these first 2 weeks. And I feel like this week was just more of the same, where we see her getting a decent amount of content in the swap episode, getting to break down the dynamics of the new tribe there, being part of the majority there. Obviously, they do have to cut Rich, and later to cut Ursula the following round. But I still feel like Karin is someone who we are getting a decent amount from. And I feel like with her not having as many negatives to her edit compared to really everyone else we already talked about, I'm starting to feel more confident in Karin to do well moving forward, and is probably the person who I have the least complaints about in terms of her edit. I feel like this was just a solid week for Karin, and that's the big reason why at this point I am considering her the front runner, which is pretty funny, as I literally had her at the very bottom of the preseason power ranking. But I feel like with the way that the season's playing out right now, Karin is the person who I feel the greatest about, which is why she's here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really help out the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Survivor 48 as well as The Amazing Race, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can just do it by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.